Microsoft Ignite conference just wrapped up last week, and there is a ton of information to parse through. So I've done my best here to capture the main points, hopefully give you some great insights, and also share a few great resources to go check out if you want more information. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
All right, well, if you notice the background from the title slide, you'll not be surprised that I'm starting with Microsoft Loop, which was one of the early announcements on the first day of Ignite and got a lot of buzz and excitement as a new tool will. So what exactly is Loop? We got a lot of really cool marketing videos, but when we actually break it down, a lot of people had a lot of questions. And one of them, I think, was, how does this fit in with existing workflows and existing tools like Microsoft Teams? So when we looked at the experiences that were shared, which were obviously preliminary at this stage, we see what is very much a canvas is probably the best word for it, that is very flexible and that allows for components to be moved around as needed on that canvas to facilitate collaboration. And what's special about that canvas, I think, is that we can see live collaboration happening in this view very easily. So we can work side by side with people, even if they're miles and miles away from us, which is increasingly common. So this is a really interesting way to see this kind of fluid framework fully realized that we've been waiting for Microsoft for a while. And it's a much better packaged version of those live components that we had previously seen. So when we look at exactly what we're going to get, I think one of the things that's really exciting is our ability to keep different tools in sync. I think one thing that we've seen through working remotely is that some of us tend to spend a lot of our days in one tool and another part of the team may spend a lot of their time in another. A really good example of that is, Dynamics 365. And you see here a component being inserted into a Teams conversation that is from Dynamics 365. But the important piece is that it's actually live data. So changes being made in this box here, as crazy as it sounds, is actually in a dynamic live way being persisted into Dynamics 365 itself. So for that salesperson that really doesn't leave that application, they still have the benefit of collaborating with others and not forcing others to come kind of over the fence into their backyard. So here now we're seeing someone on the Dynamics side seeing those live changes, getting notifications of those changes, and being able to work side by side. And this really gets to the idea of this digital fabric that Microsoft alluded to during the presentation, which is this idea of a fabric or tissue that's binding work and people together and removing some of those barriers between people being able to work together. So that, in concept, in principle, sounds amazing. But let's break it down. What exactly is being delivered here? At least, what are we expecting to see? I think there's three main things that they described. One is a workspace, which is kind of this whole dashboard that we see with this kind of pink outline here that I've added. Within that workspace, we have pages that are these flexible canvases that are dynamic and facilitate that live collaboration. And then we have components, and we can drop these fluid or live components onto the page as it suits our needs and work together on this canvas together. So this is really exciting, but if you're looking at this and thinking that this looks vaguely familiar, you're not alone. There are other tools out there that do this today. One of them is Coda, and the idea of Coda is that it's a new type of document that's different from all previous types of documents, and that it facilitates the use of building blocks, again, not unlike what we saw with Loop, with the idea of these building blocks as well, and tables that talk to each other, as well as views that facilitate everyone seeing the same data, but being able to work with that data in different ways. So Coda here is obviously kind of something that some people will look at as inspiration potentially for Loop. And another one of these is Notion, which has been around as well, which you see similar here on the left-hand side. We see some workspaces, and within those workspaces, we can expand those and see what essentially pages that contain components of information. And this is very kind of wiki-like, but kind of a new evolution or incarnation of that age-old wiki into something a lot more dynamic. So this is something to keep in mind for people that are used to using these tools. It might be nice to have something equivalent in the Microsoft 365 space, but I think Microsoft will also have to find ways to differentiate itself as well. Now, if you want a little bit more information than I could provide here, there's a really great video from Microsoft, which I've linked to here, as well as a video from one of my colleagues, Richard Harbridge, on our Tutelage YouTube channel. So definitely check that out if you want some more insights on these topics, because it's something that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be curious about. Now let's look at some of the announcements that were made around Viva, because we know Viva has been a huge focus for Microsoft over the last year, and there's been a lot of evolution in terms of functionality and even vision of how these are going to work. I'm not going to talk about pricing or licensing today. If you want some information on that, Richard also published a great video on that, so I encourage you to go check that out. But I'll talk about some of the things that caught my eye in terms of innovations. One of them was in the context of insights. If you're like me and you're in a lot of meetings, I think one of the things we're always looking at in terms of continuous improvement is how can we make our meetings more effective? And so having a little bit of guidance here through Viva Insights, which is obviously watching what we're doing in terms of our trends, how we're spending our time, it has a lot of great data that it can use to kind of showcase things that we could maybe improve in this space. So I loved seeing this panel here around leading more effective meetings, leading more healthy meeting habits, and even at the bottom here, seeing some insights in how I actually spend my meeting time. I really also like the ability to create a meeting plan for your team, which is a way to create a kind of consistent best practices type approach that you would share with your team around how best to lead meetings and what are some of the things that you're going to do as a pattern that are going to help meetings be more effective and more productive. So I liked seeing that, and that's definitely something that I would love to play with internally with some of our project teams. Now, Viva Learning, the obvious big announcement here is that Viva Learning is now generally available. There's a lot of included features that are free if you're in the right license kind of segments. And so this is great news. Viva Learning is really a really interesting piece of technology. I love seeing this integrated right within the Teams application. And I think where there's really going to be some interesting applications is the integration with third-party sources, which we know is going to require some kind of paid add-on. And there's a lot more information about that piece online if you're looking for that. But definitely recommend everyone take a look at this now that it's more widely available. Another really interesting announcement was the announcement of a whole new Viva module, Ally.io, which was a recent acquisition by Microsoft. And Ally.io, if you're not familiar with, is a leading OKR company. So what their purpose in this whole kind of Viva philosophy is to align people's work with team goals and also corporate objectives. So what we're going to be able to do is not only have a standalone Viva module where we're going to be able to see an end-to-end solution for goal management and OKRs, we're going to be able to see within that Viva module not only what we're doing as individuals, but what our teams and departments doing driving towards some of those key objectives. We'll also be able to integrate Ally into existing Viva modules, and there's a couple examples that were shown here. One was integrating that into Viva Daily Briefing, that kind of nice email that we get at the beginning of the day telling us what to kind of stay on top of. Definitely seeing our objectives in that context is going to be helpful. Also, this data we were told is going to surface or bubble up into Power BI, which makes a lot of sense as we can then build really powerful dashboards that are driven by that performance-based or goal-based metrics, which is really important. So I'm really excited to see this come in. I'm definitely really happy to welcome Ally.io into the larger Viva family and really excited to see how we can use this going forward. Now, if you want any more resources on Viva, there are a lot that I can point you to. There's a couple great Ignite sessions that are top of my mind when I think back on that. There's also a number of great blog articles, all of which I've tried to include here. If you're looking for the Viva roadmaps, I tried to stitch them all together, but there are a few of these online that you can find. This is really a good way to see what's kind of available now versus what's coming kind of in the coming months. So definitely take a look at this. Now moving ahead to Teams. Now Teams continues to be a huge focus of innovation. obviously. And there's a lot of announcements around Teams in the context of Teams that we can definitely touch on today. Again, I'm only scraping the surface here, but these are the top ones that really caught my attention. Now, one of them, of course, is Teams Connect, and we've been waiting for this for a while. So when I say Teams Connect, think of shared channels. We've been talking about this for a little while, but we're seeing a lot more of the visual experience, and that tells us that we're getting a lot closer here. Now, they're telling us that this should be available in public preview in Q1 of 2022, so that's not too far off. And really where this fits in is working across organizations or across tenants, which today is a little bit challenging. If you're working with partners, you're working with clients, all of which are kind of siloed within their own Azure Active Directories, you can get invited into their tenant and participate in and collaborate with them in their team's environment, but flipping between them is a little bit painful, right? And so the whole idea with a shared channel is that instead of having to flip between tenants, just make that channel shared so that we can all see them within our own environments and collaborate a lot more easily. And obviously this is quite complex in the back end when it comes to how AD is managing this, but love that this is going to be possible, because this is going to make collaboration, especially for groups like ours that are working with dozens and dozens of different partners, to be able to kind of make that a lot more seamless going forward. So really exciting. Now, another exciting announcement was Teams Mesh. So hashtag Metaverse here, Microsoft not to be left behind when it comes to the Metaverse. We are seeing an announcement around Mesh, which is also driven by a recent acquisition of Altspace VR. Now, this here we're seeing is the ability to generate 2D and 3D meeting experiences with personalized avatars, and not only personalized avatars of ourselves, but also immerse those avatars in physical and digital worlds, right? So we see examples here of being able to have meetings actually in the digital world as our avatars, and still be able to work on documents or any kind of file that we would normally want to work on within the Microsoft 365 suite. So this actually brings that kind of live collaboration back that we've kind of missed out on during COVID and for other reasons, back into the realm of possibility. It does a lot of other great things for accessibility as well, because we know that some people either can't or are reluctant to participate in video conversations. And for some people, this is going to be a bridge to joining that conversation and feeling more comfortable. So we've seen this here in the video, but also kind of in some screenshots of meetings where we have people that are participating as avatars in the midst of other people actually with their video on. So there's going to be definitely looks like a blended possibility there, which is definitely interesting. But I'm curious to see how that plays out, and whether people will start to default towards avatars, or if the avatars is just going to be kind of a short-lived kind of fun thing that will eventually fade away. But nevertheless, I'm very excited about the kind of virtual experiences that will allow us to collaborate in these digital spaces. And I think we're seeing across the industry, well beyond just Microsoft, a lot of interest and buzz around this being the future of the internet itself. Some other interesting Teams announcements that will facilitate the user experience and the meeting experience. One is being able to assign roles to other people in the meeting while you're scheduling it. And this is going to be really, really helpful when you have co-presenters that you want to assign from the beginning, because you know that someone's going to be co-presenting with you, and assigning that role right as you book the meeting. Another thing, if you're like us and you're starting to make use of the raised hand feature, you might have noticed that when you have a large cohort on your call, sometimes it's hard to keep track of who you should kind of open up the conversation to first, because it wasn't clear who raised their hand first or in what order they raised their hand. And sometimes that's a bit awkward. So seeing the order in which hands were raised will be just a nice little simple addition, but I think very powerful in certain situations. And another one that I think some people have been asking for is just the ability to either pin or hide their own video. Not everyone is the same. Some of us really like to have our video pinned so that we know what we look like, and others find it very distracting to watch themselves, right? So having the ability to do either of those, depending on the person, is going to be a really great add-on, because I've heard this from a lot of people that it's very fatiguing to watch themselves. And again, sometimes to the point where you're actually kind of losing track of the conversation because you're just spending the time watching yourself and the way that you're interacting on video. So these are expected in early 2022, and these are all things that I think will be great to see in Teams. Now, one that I'm not so sure about is the chat with self feature that they announced, where basically you'll be able to send messages to yourself in Teams. And this is really, intended, and I think quite obviously it's not intended to be a real conversation. It's intended just to be a safe place to put down notes, rough ideas, things that you don't want to share necessarily with someone else. Or maybe while you're in Teams or while you're on the go, you have Teams open, an idea pops into your head, and without having to jump to another application to log that, you have an easy place to drop it just in a chat to yourself. So I like the idea. I'm curious how it's going to be used, and I'm definitely intrigued to see if, once this becomes available to myself, whether this is something I actually start using, or if I find that there's still better ways to log that information. Because I think one of the challenges I have already is that I have information in a lot of different places, notes to myself among many, right, of those issues. So if I have yet another place where I've left notes for myself, I'm concerned that I'm going to spend time stitching them together. One thing that'll be fun, I think, to see is an increase in the emoticons and being able to chat with a bit more emotion than the current very limited 6 available emojis. And I can't say how many times I've looked and wished I had a facepalm emoji reaction to put on certain messages, but maybe that's just me. But I love seeing that we'll have over 800 3D new emojis to play with. I think that really opens up the door to having a little bit more fun with Teams. And also not trying to fit our emotions into just 6 small little boxes, I think is going to be helpful. Functionally, I know many people use the delay delivery in Outlook, and I for one, definitely do that. And I love seeing that this is trickling into Teams, especially when we think about the idea of shared channels coming in and potentially more cross-enterprise, cross-corporation collaboration happening, and being a little bit more sensitive to time zones and people's working hours. I think the delay delivery fits into that very, very nicely. It allows us a way to make sure that we're still not disrupting people when they're in their off hours, and it allows us to respect that boundary. So delay delivery, it's an option right now in Outlook, and if you're not using it, I definitely recommend you have a look at it if you're in that scenario, and seeing that available in Teams just makes sense. Very related to that is easily being able to see a colleague's time zone. So you see on this slide here, I've opened a people card for Retta, and I actually see that I'm 4 hours behind her in terms of my time zone. This is a simple thing, but if you're like me and you're working with people across many, many time zones, it can be a little bit mentally taxing at times to always keep track of who you're talking to, what time zone they're in, and how that should impact your actions right at that moment. So this is going to be helpful, and it's definitely should hopefully reduce that mental burden a little bit. Q&A experience we've had in Teams, that's not necessarily new, but they did showcase during Ignite an improved experience that they say will allow us to have more structure for both open and moderated meetings and webinars. I like the experience that I'm seeing in the early visuals, and it's definitely something that I think, especially with large seminars, for example, when you're really trying to triage those questions and create some structure around them so that people see which questions have been answered, this is something that I will definitely make use of. So it looks like this will be in public preview starting in November, and hopefully in the new year we'll see this starting to roll out to everyone. Now, overall in Teams, there were a few other things, and I think one of them in this little animated GIF here is around search experience. And the search experience for me has been quite painful in Teams for quite some time. So I'm really, really glad that I'm seeing investments here in the way that search is working in Teams, because, previously or even today in your environment, you'll notice that almost none of the real estate of Teams, let alone any of the functionality that we've come to expect from Microsoft Search, is really leveraged in the Teams context. So seeing that in Teams, seeing a dedicated, messages, vertical here, people vertical, files vertical, and even some filtering embedded within that is going to be really helpful, because if we want to continue to drive people towards Teams as that kind of go-to hub for collaboration, and we'll put a caveat with Loop in the mix now, how that all will work. I think we want to continue to do that. So the search experience really, really needs to be strong. So I'm glad we're seeing these innovations coming in. Now, if you want a couple other really good assets to check out around Teams, definitely check out the shared channels video from Richard on my team. It's a great little video on some really great real life scenarios where this will be useful. And there's some great Ignite videos as well as some blogs as well. So check those out if Teams is really of high interest to you. Now, on the Insights side, it's something that, right now doesn't necessarily have a fully fleshed out brand around it, but during Ignite, we did hear quite a bit about Context IQ and how this turns insights into action. And we saw this in a couple different scenarios, and I was really excited about what I was seeing here. So for example, on the screen, I'm typing an email, and how many times a day am I typing an email where I'm trying to attach the right file, I'm trying to mention the right person, and I have to always go and, for example, a file, go find the file, create the link, make sure that I'm pasting the link in. It all just adds up to taking a lot of time away from more productive activities. So if this is really going to work the way they're pitching it, that it's really going to be helpful where I start typing a file name and it gives me that link, and it gives me the right kind of link, and I can also mention people, and it doesn't send it to the wrong David or the wrong John. I've done that as well, unfortunately, despite my best efforts. So if that can help me there, that'll be great. And if we can even suggest meeting availability without having to open our calendar, man, I really see the kind of whole chunk of my day that I spend crafting these emails drastically getting reduced. And that's really exciting to me. So I hope that what we see here will actually be the experience that we get, and that it really is helpful. We did see other scenarios as well where a lot of talk was made in many of the sessions during Ignite around better integration with Dynamics. I was surprised by how many times this was referred to. And one of the contexts for that was Context IQ as well as Loop, where you saw that previous video I shared earlier. But in the context of Context IQ, the interesting thing was being able to mention objects that are actually Dynamics 365 in origin, and easily having the system recognize that those are from Dynamics, and providing a recommendation for that as a component that I can drop into Teams. So this is obviously kind of between kind of under the umbrella of Loop, but also Context IQ, where it's recognizing that Alpine Ski House is a Dynamics 365 object that I might want to drop into this chat. So really interesting here. I like how they're showing these different experiences all coming together and really making our lives as collaborators a lot better. And I think one of the things that they're trying to address is this I think common need that we've heard repeatedly over many years now, that looking for files is such a painful thing, especially as a remote worker, when you don't have that individual you can just go to in the next cubicle to ask for where that thing is, which, let's face it, was never efficient. But now that we don't even have that availability the same way we did, it's really become not just a major thing, it's become a critical thing, right? So it's really interesting to see that we're seeing more of this type of insight being proactively surfaced in different contexts to help us find that information without having to dig for it. A couple interesting assets for Context IQ here. One is around Microsoft Editor, which is kind of the first scenario I presented, and another around kind of Dynamics 365 integration. Let's move on to Yammer, because Yammer continues to see investments and it continues to see innovation. And we saw a few of those at Ignite and a number of them right before Ignite as well. So I wanted to share a few of those. One of them is around community visibility in Yammer. And one of the really interesting insights I heard in one of the sessions from Microsoft was this statement that once users are able to find and become members of at least 5 communities in Yammer, we see a much higher retention of that user in Yammer in an engaged manner. that was really interesting to me. So that speaks to sometimes challenges you see when you do a very light or first pilot of Yammer and you only roll out 1 or 2 communities and you see that that engagement doesn't really stick. This is something that really is something to consider, right? That maybe part of it is that you need to have that critical mass there first for a user for them to really see the value of being in that ecosystem. So think about that, and I think what Microsoft is providing here is better ways to suggest and discover communities that may be of interest. So that was previously available, it's there today in Yammer, but it's kind of buried. So the suggested communities, they're really, pushing that up quite a bit here in terms of where it's being surfaced and making that a lot more visible. And I, for one, am a big fan of that. So, if I'm part of a New York community and there's also a Boston community in Yammer and, I can join that and I'm curious about what's happening in Boston, make that more available to me so that I see that there's more happening in Yammer than I first thought. Another piece that I love, I absolutely adore the Q&A and Yammer. It's become something that I would recommend to almost every organization right now. I love how they're moving the answer upvoting a little bit further along as well from kind of the best answer, which we had, now to be able to collect, kind of count and collect the best answers based on how many times it's been upvoted is also going to be available. So this is going to help really identify the best answer in a quantifiable way. Sometimes we need that, sometimes we don't, but this will be a tool like in our toolbox, right? And it will be a great way to get engagement from people when we see that, my vote is actually easily viewable and counted and something I can see on the screen. We also see better integration coming between Yammer and Topics and Viva Topics in both ways. So in the context of Yammer, we see that Topics now, this idea of Yammer Topics being something else floating around, is now going away and being replaced by the same thing as Viva Topics, right? So one and one only, one to rule them all. Topics being surfaced in Yammer here, Mark 8. And we should see that also flow across to Yammer. So flow across to Viva as well. So on the Viva topic side, we'll also see that unified integration going that way as well. So now we see actually in the context of Viva Topics, I see Q&A that are being bubbled up here and proposing that these might be really good topics and things to be added to the topic center. A little bit of further reading here for Yammer. There's a great video from Ignite I'd recommend you check out if you're really interested in some of these in more detail. Here's the link for that one. And there's also a few other things in the blogs that you might be interested in, but definitely check out this video from Ignite. Now, Outlook, there's a couple announcements that I wanted to share that were interesting. In the context of Outlook, they shared a new board view, which is a little bit of a new take in some ways. In some ways, it's not really that different, but really the whole power of the board view, think of board here as dashboard, right? Where you have your own custom canvas, you have your own dashboard that allows you to create a view of your calendar alongside other things that you want to look at against your calendar. And sometimes that may mean your tasks, it could be sticky notes, it could be files, links, goals, reminders, whatever it may be. But here we again have the idea of a custom canvas, custom to the end user, that allows that end user to really craft an experience that makes sense for them. So nothing fundamentally different here about the way we're seeing our calendar, but we're being able to put it in the context of other things more easily than we could before. Now, Meeting Scheduler is something I've talked about previously, so I won't kind of go over this in depth again, but we did see a little bit more into the mobile experience here, which I've included down at the bottom left. And I liked the experience I was seeing because it was quite easy to follow, and it's definitely something that we knew needed to make sense in mobile. Otherwise, we were going to miss out on a huge chunk of the potential value of the Meeting Scheduler. So the Meeting Scheduler is essentially a Cortana-assisted functionality or function or tool or whatever you want to call it that's going to support making those meetings much easier for you. So finding available times, proposing those available times, and also making sure that things can be rescheduling, taking time zone into account, and making sure that everyone is up to date. So that's definitely something that's very interesting and really like to see kind of the mobile application getting more fleshed out. Now, if you're an old SharePoint stalwart like me, you're always digging for updates in the SharePoint space, and there were a few that were very interesting. Some of these blur the lines here between SharePoint and lists, but they're not really very different, right? Lists, originally came from SharePoint, and now they're available as standalone, but they're also available within the context of SharePoint. So I have some lists announcements here as well. One of them is a new view, which is also called Board View, not to be confused with the Outlook Board View, but it is a little bit challenging sometimes when they use the same names for different things here. But I love the idea of the Board View here. It's kind of going back to the old Kanban mentality, where you can create cards but easily drag them between different columns of the board to represent typically a status, but you could use it for other things. So really great experience here. I love how easy it looks to be able to drag kind of cards from one to the other, and I liked their example here of a recruitment scenario here, right, where they're going through different recruitment stages with different individuals and dragging them as the statuses change. Another cool announcement was support for rich text editing in the grid view in lists, which, previously we could do some rich text editing, but we couldn't really do it in the grid view. You had to do it kind of in the editing panel. So a lot of people really like the grid view, and I think always want to be as much as possible on par in terms of functionality. This is really amazing to see that for those grid view people out there, that they're not going to miss out on the rich text editing. It will still be available. Another thing which I think is just a general good practice whenever we're using filters, certainly when we design search-based solutions and filters are part of that, we always want to make sure that we're showing active filters in a very obvious way. And oftentimes in many applications, it's using the pills method, right? A pill representing the kind of little colored box here showing me which filters I have active. So you see here I have active, new application, on hold, and position equals project manager as active filters. So this not only quickly shows me which filters I have active, but it also allows me to individually remove one of those filters very easily. So I can remove one of them at a time, or on the far right I can actually clear all the filters in one fell swoop if I choose to. Some other innovations around migration. We saw a little bit of a teaser for box migration. Now we can already support some box migration scenarios, but the ability to scan and assess the box environment before we migrate was not there. And so I love having the ability to do that pre-check, or whatever you prefer to call this. But it really helps give you some confidence that you're going to run into fewer issues. And if there are some obvious glaring issues, it's really a helping hand in identifying those so that you can take corrective action before you try to execute that migration. Now, the support for workflow migration was really interesting. Now, imagine you're in a scenario where you're migrating from on-prem, let's say SharePoint 2016. You have a bunch of workflows in place, and you're preparing yourself for recreating all of those manually in Power Automate. Well, imagine if SharePoint could actually migrate those workflows automatically into Power Automate and map those actions for us. Of course, there's some validation you'll want to do, and that'll definitely be part of this, but I love seeing that there's at least a step towards that, because that, for organizations that had enormous volumes of those custom workflows, it was an enormous task to recreate them. So even if this starts them towards that path and it's just a validation exercise remaining, this is still going to save people a lot of time. Now, Tenant Rename is I think bigger than SharePoint, but if you look at user voice, the ability to rename your tenant in Microsoft 365 was one of the most requested user voice items, at least that I had seen, and a lot of people were very frustrated that this was lacking. So I think a lot of companies that went through mergers or acquisitions, or even just rebranding, the names of your Microsoft 365 or your SharePoint environment were kind of forever locked to that first name that you originally put in, and could not be changed unless you were willing to completely migrate your environment, which for a lot of companies was a non-starter. So being able to do this, obviously there's a lot going on behind the scenes that needs to work for this name to be changed without breaking everything. So obviously there was complexity there that Microsoft had to sort out, but love that we're seeing at least a public preview. I think a lot of people are going to be very, very happy about this. People that have been waiting for a long time and just being, every day frustrated by the fact that that name no longer represented the brand or no longer represented the larger company anymore. So this is a great, great thing that looking forward to see. Now, this was one that wasn't an announcement, but one eagle-eyed watcher of Ignite caught this, and I had to reshare it because it's one thing that I've found that I've been looking for. And there had been discussion a while ago about this idea of automatically generating a table of contents for a page in SharePoint based on the content tags that are already available. So, when we create a text web part in SharePoint and we apply a certain heading style to that, we should in theory be able to use those heading styles to automatically generate a table of contents for us that's clickable and creates a bit of a navigation help for these longer, more text-heavy pages. And this is kind of just almost went into an abyss somewhere, and I hadn't heard anything about it for a long time and was getting worried that it had been abandoned. But see here in this screenshot that maybe there is something coming, and hopefully it's a table of contents web part that does exactly what I described, that allows us to drop it right on a page and even right into our page templates, so that as our authors create new sections in their pages, the table of contents automatically updates itself, creating a breadcrumb trail for anyone looking at the contents of the page and needing to jump to a specific section more quickly. Now, on the Syntex side, one really cool announcement was around content assembly. And in some ways, content assembly is kind of the reverse of a document understanding model, where in that context, we're actually extracting information from a document and storing it in a list. With content assembly, we're actually creating documents dynamically by inserting and filling in placeholder text in the body of a document. So imagine you have a statement of work like is being shown on the screen here, and there's some common fields that always need to be changed based on the customer and based on that specific statement of work. And imagine maybe it's through automation or maybe it's manually, but ideally through an automated workflow, you're collecting some of these key pieces of information like client name, address, maybe the billing rate, for example, and that information is available in a list. And with the click of a button, or even automatically once we reach a certain stage in the process, our statement of work automatically gets created. Now that's really cool, and that's something I really hope our company can make use of going forward. Now, also in the context of Syntex was an improved metadata search offering. So previously, within a Syntex-enabled library, we could search, but it was limited to 5 fixed fields, which was of limited value. Now, with the new roadmap entry, we're seeing that we should soon be able to search by any metadata field available on the library via kind of this drop-down experience from the search box. So I love how they've tied that into the search box through that contextual search that we've come to expect from Microsoft Search. I know a lot of people will look at this and wonder if this is something that would be ever available outside of Syntex in any standard library, because I know a big question mark right now from people is where are we at in terms of being able to add our own custom refiners for search experiences. So this is definitely in that same vein, but definitely under the umbrella of Syntex, at least as far as the announcement was framed so far. Now, a couple resources I'd suggest you consider if you're looking at lists and you're looking at SharePoint very closely. There's a few great videos out there and a couple great blog posts that cover a lot of great information, including what's coming, as well as a lot more detail than I can get into in this short video. Here's one of the many roadmaps that were shared, this one for lists. But to be honest, if you're looking for roadmaps, I'd really encourage you check out the pretty comprehensive list being maintained by Susan Hanley. Here's the link that she shared to that kind of live document that's growing as she discovers more and more of these roadmaps. And instead of me trying to recreate already great work, I'll just point you right there. So definitely recommend that if you're a fan of roadmaps and really want to see where all of these products are headed in the next little while. Thanks for joining us for this Ignite recap video. A lot of information. I hope some of it was of interest, and I really hope that we can catch you in the next video. Thank you.